In this lecture, we're going to talk about personnel shortages, and that can be caused by human, nature, or environmental. And I have to admit, when I recorded this lecture last time in 2017-18 in the before times, it was an entirely different lecture, right? Because I did talk about pandemics and how we respond, but now, after having been through one for a couple of years, it's an entirely different perspective. And personnel shortages is one of those things that I think most people, at least up till now, have been not really good about. We think about the hardware, the software, the network, all the stuff where we need redundancy. If we have built it right, well, then we have that redundancy. But what about people? What do we do when we don't have enough staff to manage all the critical jobs that we have? I have worked in many organizations where there was only one person who could do certain jobs. If there was an issue with the backup and this guy was on vacation, well then it had to wait 3 weeks. Or if there was a problem on specific servers. And that is exactly why the cross-training is so important and that we have the people redundancy that we need just like we do with our systems. What do we do when there's a snowstorm or a hurricane or something more common, and what's more apropos now, what do we do when half our staff has the flu? How much staff do we need to keep the lights on? Just the bare minimum of critical functions. You can think of this as the MOR for hardware, minimum operating requirements. And it is important that critical staff is identified by position, not by name. And for all the positions that are deemed critical, here we build in more redundancy. That is, hire more staff, cross-train more, whatever we need to do to make sure that this function will continue almost regardless of what happens, or at least to a point where it's unlikely we don't have someone who can do this job. Just like anything else in IT, we're never 100% safe, we're never 100% secure, but enough. What is our risk tolerance for this specific position? The disaster recovery plan I talked about earlier that was 10 years old, one of the mistakes they had, they named everybody by name. We never ever do that. In IT, it's pretty common to have a 5 to 8% turnover every single year. That means that between 5 to 8% of the people who are here today will not be here in a year. So if I pull out my plan that's 10 years old and I have Bob and Jane listed for these specific tasks, well then it's probably likely that Bob left 4 years ago and Jane, she might leave in 2 weeks. So if something bad happens, we can call Bob and Jane as much as we want to. They are most likely not going to be able to help us. So in our plan, we have positions identified or groups. We have group numbers, we have group emails. If it is a critical role, then they probably have someone who's on call and has to respond if there is an incident. And then in an attempt to be funny and also maybe a little relevant, I put here, insert your own COVID-19 work experiences here, because I'm sure most of you have had some weird, eye-opening experiences with how a pandemic can completely change how we do things, what is important, and what is possible. So take a minute, think a little bit about how COVID-19 has affected the personnel shortages where you work, how it could potentially have done it, and what we could have done to mitigate that. All right, now back to the lecture. And of course, our personnel shortages can come from a multitude of things. It doesn't just have to be infections or pandemics. It could be a strike. If our staff is unhappy with something that we do or do not do, they might start a strike and walk out. What can we do to respond to that? How do we mitigate that? And how much staff is the minimal possible requirements that we can keep functioning as an organization with, and for how long can we keep that up? You can see the red line here, right? Our BCP and DRP is really us being that 3-year-old asking all the questions, what if this, what if that, what if this, what if this? And then when we have come up with all those scenarios, well then we look for possible ways to mitigate the effects. In the last 3-4 corporate jobs that I had, I have spent more than 50, maybe less than 100 meetings trying to explain to our senior management why being able to work remotely is an amazing idea. And everywhere. And I do mean every single leadership has said this is not possible. We're not going to implement. It is too expensive. It is too complex. There's no upside. And then all of a sudden, 2020 rolls around and every single company has worked from home. Isn't it magical how it wasn't really that it wasn't possible, it was just they didn't really want to. And then as the last part of this lecture, let's look at travel. When our employees travel, we need to make sure that both they and the data they bring with them is safe. And here, remember, for the exam and for real life, people are always most important. If there are certain places that we just don't deem safe, the State Department say don't travel there, well then we should probably avoid sending people to those locations. We might also want to limit what they bring with them of hardware and what they can access from that location. Maybe we block their VPN. But if they have to bring laptop, smartphone, whatever, then everything is fully encrypted. We monitor the device. We have the remote wipe capabilities. We use VPNs and all the other appropriate security measures that we can use to ensure that our data is secure enough. And with that, we are done with this lecture. I will see you in the next one.